Hi, everybody. I am Brian Griffiths. Welcome to another episode of the Duckpin Podcast. We have a great show lined up for you today. We talk with Brandon Thurston about wrestling business. He's from the very influential site, Wrestlenomics.com, and the host of the Wrestlenomics radio podcast. All that and more. Stick with us on the Duckpin Podcast. If you're a fan of professional wrestling or a fan of business like I am, you probably should be a fan of our guest on today's show. He is Brandon Thurston from the very influential blog Wrestlenomics. Brandon, it's great to be with you here today.
Well, Brian, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here to talk wrestling business with you.
Yeah, it's definitely great. For folks who are not familiar with Wrestlenomics, the site has been online since 2013. So give a little bit of background about the site and the history of Wrestlenomics.
So I've been writing about wrestling business since about 2015. And as you mentioned, Wrestlenomics has been a word or a brand that has been used since 2013 because it was a brand that Chris Harrington started. Chris Harrington may be known to some other people better as Mookie or Mookie Ghana on Twitter. He now works for AEW, but before he did that, he and I co-hosted the Wrestlenomics podcast. We sort of found each other through a common interest in wrestling business. I started to get really interested in the wrestling business around the time of the launch of the WWE Network because I've always been interested, of course, in wrestling. Wrestling's been a big part of my life for my entire adult life at a minimum. And I've always been really interested in new media and the way that, new media affects, economies and cultures and all sorts of parts of our lives. And when the WWE Network was coming out, I was really fascinated with how that was going to affect the wrestling industry. So it's sort of like the perfect combination of things that I would be really interested in. And from there, it sort of grew into writing about the wrestling business and getting to know Mookie better. And we would sort of work together and communicate more online. He lives in Minnesota, but he previously had lived in Rochester, New York. I live in Buffalo, New York, and Rochester and Buffalo are about an hour and a half apart. And so he had been involved in the independent wrestling scene in Rochester when he lived there. And I've been involved in the independent wrestling scene in Buffalo, since I've been about 18 years old. So it turns out we knew a lot of the same people. And I think we'd even been at a couple of the same events, but didn't really know who each other were at that time. So anyway, we worked together on stuff and we started doing the Wrestlenomics podcast on a weekly basis in 2017. And he left at the end of 2018 to go work for AEW. And towards the end of that time, he was doing some research for AEW. He had been, sort of contacted by Tony Khan and was doing some of the business plan building. And I helped him do some of the research for that. And he eventually got hired as a full-time employee for AEW at the beginning of 2019. Of course, that's when AEW launched as a company. And in 2019, I sort of just had the podcast, and I did it every now and then, especially coinciding with the quarterly earnings calls for WWE. And especially since the pandemic, though, I've been doing a lot more with it, and we have controlled the Wrestlenomics.com domain all this time, but hadn't really done that much with it. But especially since this year, since the new year, I've turned it into a blog, and that's where my writing has been lately. And that's where there are links to a number of resources. If you're ever trying to look at TV viewership, or even there are some resources in there about attendance and about pay-per-view buys and things like that. Basically, there's a link to a lot of the spreadsheets that I reference a lot. But a lot of my written work, or all my written work at the moment, is up there, all the new stuff. And I've been doing the podcast every week since the pandemic took effect. And every week that there has been Empty Arena Wrestling, I have been doing a podcast.
Well, let's talk about the Empty Arena Wrestling and the pandemic kind of overall. It's kind of been a fascinating development in the business because, for so many years, a lot of people would see, think about empty arena shows or, think of them as kind of less than, even going back to when the AWA had the Team Challenge series back in the 90s when they were on their last legs. And, a lot of people had, I think, negative thoughts about where empty arena wrestling was going to go. Some companies, obviously, Ring of Honor hasn't run a show in 6 months, but WWE, AEW, Impact have all been able to keep going, and WWE particularly has been extremely profitable during this time period. Overall, what can you say is the impact of the pandemic on the business at large, knowing that a company like the WWE has been able to be extremely profitable, and knowing that some of these other companies haven't really been able to run at all?
Right. There's been a number of effects. In the shortest term, it's been more profitable, at least for WWE. I think maybe for AEW in a sense, right? Obviously, nobody's been able to sell tickets. AEW just started to sell limited tickets at Daly's Place just recently, but nobody's been able to sell tickets. In WWE's case, that's not even that big of a deal because they have 3 major divisions, WWE does, that they report in their public filings, and it's media, live events, and consumer products. And the live events business last year, if you took away the WrestleMania week, would not be profitable, I think. I think in 3 out of the 4 quarters, it was not profitable. The only profitable quarter was WrestleMania. Without checking, I think the entire year was profitable with WrestleMania, but probably if you took it out, it wouldn't be. So the point is, most of their events apparently are not profitable. But it's allowed them to run shows, especially when they were running all their shows at the Performance Center, was much cheaper. So it turns out it's very expensive to run TV out of a sports arena. On Monday and Friday, you're traveling all over the country and moving lots of equipment and lots of people in and out of buildings. That's very expensive. And to instead be forced to do it at the Performance Center where everything is fixed. You don't have to load in and load out. You don't have to travel with trucks all around the country. It's much cheaper to do TV out of a fixed location. So you're saving a lot of money in the short term, but in the longer term, it's been at least one factor that has contributed to a decline in WWE's TV ratings. Now, WWE's TV ratings have been declining, in year-over-year comparisons for a number of years. It's been quite a predictable pattern, at least for Raw, which has been on USA Network for decades now, right? In the case of SmackDown has fluctuated more because SmackDown has had the benefit of, being on Sci-Fi and then getting upgraded to the USA Network, and then getting moved from Thursday to Tuesday, and then being, and in that step also going from a tape show to a live show, and in that step having its own separate roster. So the value of SmackDown has been increased over the last 5 years or so, and that resulted in WWE being able to split off Raw and SmackDown in the TV deal that it just entered into in October, where now SmackDown is on Fox, and they're getting a lot more money out of SmackDown than they would have otherwise. But again, to go back to what I was saying, though, Raw has declined and SmackDown have declined in TV ratings at a rate that is worse than the decline that NXT and AEW have had over the same time. So if you look through the beginning of the pandemic, this all started in the middle of March, and all 4 of these major shows sort of slid to about the same degree for the first couple months. But then around May or June, NXT and AEW started to get a decent recovery, almost to the point where now they are where they were in February before the pandemic. But Raw and SmackDown, at least as of a couple of weeks ago, maybe things are starting to maybe the pattern is starting to change now with Thunderdome. But Raw and SmackDown had not recovered like NXT and AEW had. And that just brings into question, where WWE does their TV deals in 5-year terms for their US agreement. And in fact, their UK and India deals are almost exactly aligned. They're off by about a quarter. So all of their deals are going to expire and had expired in the previous round around the same time. So the question is, in a couple of years when they have to renew the deals that will expire around 2024, how are networks going to look at the program, looking at their TV viewership and think about, what should we pay for this? Should we give it an upgrade? Should we keep them about the same value, or should we give them a downgrade? Viewership was declining, in the last negotiations as well. But, as people say all the time, well, TV overall is declining. So whatever the case was with their viewership in 2018, they were nonetheless able to negotiate a 3.6x increase. So it more than tripled their US TV rights fees. But now, for whatever reason, analysts and maybe investors are starting to question, at least as of the July 30th earnings call. There were a lot of questions about the ratings, and we're about a year into Vince or another executive having to come up with some reason why metrics like viewership and ticket sales and merchandise sales have been and WWE Network subscriptions as well have been in a decline since roughly 2016. And I think analysts are starting to, these are the financial analysts who kind of play a large part in determining what WWE's share price is going to be. I think they're starting to really question whether the ratings are declining to such a degree that there's going to be, maybe some effect on WWE's TV value in the future. So I think the pandemic has really accelerated a trajectory that the wrestling business was already on. I think, in September 2019, before we knew that there was going to be any COVID-19, I wrote an article talking about how I think that, we were about to enter this era where you're going to have NXT and AEW on major cable, in the majority of U.S. homes. And they're going to, in that sense, have a similar distribution platform that Raw and SmackDown have. And I just think it's unsustainable that you're going to have two brands that are at least better at creating stars and telling stories than Raw and SmackDown have proven to have been. And while Raw and SmackDown have much more of a strong legacy and have a much larger audience to begin with, I just don't see how it's sustainable that Raw and SmackDown can, for the foreseeable future, continue to be the leaders in a television landscape where they've got two brands, NXT, which obviously is a part of WWE, and AEW, which is not. When you've got two brands that are better or stand to be better at creating stars and telling stories than WWE is. So I think we were on that trajectory already in the first place. And COVID came, and that disrupted everybody's lives. It disrupted everybody's, daily routines. I think that maybe contributed to a lot of the viewership declines. I think taking the crowds away also caused Raw and SmackDown viewers who were, I believe, less engaged, and they were less, maybe in a sense, like less loyal to being a viewer of those programs. They were, sort of. I think there were a greater portion of Raw and SmackDown viewers who were sort of hanging from the last thread of their engagement and of their loyalty to continue to watch the program. So once COVID came and you had a lack of audience there, a live audience there, they were easier to stop watching. It was easier for them to stop watching maybe than it was for NXT and AEW viewers to stop watching, because maybe they were tended to be more deeply invested in the program, although obviously their audiences are like less than half of what a Raw or SmackDown audience is. So I think the pattern accelerated starting in March and through the summer. And now we're at a place here where WWE is responding to those questions about ratings. And they've introduced the Thunderdome, and it's going to be more expensive. So all that money that they saved by staying at the PC, it's not clear how much they are spending and how much the Thunderdome is going to cost them. I think it's certainly going to be more expensive than it was being at the PC. I would estimate that it's going to be maybe as much as a normal pre-COVID TV expense would be. So the extra profitability is getting eaten into. Now, all that said, WWE's going to still be probably as profitable as it's ever been in 2020. But they're clearly under pressure to remedy the situation, and that's at least one major reason why we have the Thunderdome now.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because, one of the drivers, obviously I'm somebody who's watched since they were 6 years old. Hulk Hogan was the champ. I've floated in, but mostly stayed in the product for 35 years now. And Fox, a lot of the Fox deal, from my view, was aimed to expand the universe, to bring in more casual fans. The creative on Monday and Friday nights on Raw and SmackDown has been less than great. I think a lot of people will agree on that. And you combine that with the look of the Performance Center, the entire product looks overall more minor league. Is the Thunderdome a reaction specifically to the ratings decline during COVID, or do you think that it just goes all the way back to what you're talking about with the ratings decline looking back to September?
I think COVID accelerated the ratings decline. And I suppose, if ratings were fairly strong, or at least performing, or had bounced back at least to the degree that AEW and NXT did, I don't think we see I don't think we see the Thunderdome. That would be my guess. Somebody asked me on Twitter just a little while ago, do you think the Thunderdome was something that was planned for weeks or months ahead of time? And I would guess not, just because we heard reports that I think from the Observer, that maybe among others as well, that W was thinking about still doing still doing SummerSlam in Boston, maybe doing it outdoors in New Jersey. So that seemed to be still on the table, as opposed to doing this Thunderdome. I think, and it seems within the pattern of the decision making of Vince McMahon to just sort of do something sort of on short order to put this Thunderdome together, and to address these problems and these questions that he was facing in the July 30th earnings call. So I mean, I don't know, but that would be my guess, that if Raw and SmackDown had held up better through the summer, I think there's not as much of a reason to have the Thunderdome, to spend the expenses associated with it, if you're saving lots of money, and just keep doing TV and save the money, and viewership is good enough. But they clearly got some signals that viewership is not good enough, so they felt that they had to do something to address it.
Do you think Thunderdome's a concept that survives the crowdless, the empty arena era?
I would be surprised. It looks very expensive. It is. I think it's something that is clearly an alternative to having real fans there. I mean, the magic of having fans there is that they can instantly react. They are the one thing in W programming that they cannot control, and that who has to genuinely react to what's happening. From what I've seen of the Thunderdome so far, it doesn't seem like it's a great substitute. I mean, but maybe it's better than an empty arena, or just having NXT people there, reacting because they're paid to.
Let's talk about a couple of the other companies now. First off, Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor hasn't had a real, hasn't had a major show since Free Enterprise back in February, which my family was fortunate enough to attend, living close to Baltimore. As my daughter's first show, so that was pretty cool. But they've had no shows for 6 months. Marty Scurll, as the head booker, was caught up in some of the sexual scandals that have been going on. So I guess my question is, with ROH having been off for 6 months, how much does that hurt their business in the long run? And does being owned by a major company like Sinclair, who has all of the television access, who has a lot of money to spend on the product, is that going to protect them from some more drastic changes in the future?
I mean, it's hard for me to say what's happening with Ring of Honor because they're not public. But Sinclair Broadcasting is public, but we know far less about Ring of Honor than we do WB. But with that said, apparently they were the reason why we had WB and AEW continue to do TV is because so much of the revenue is dependent on money that they get from the networks that they broadcast on. So in the case of Ring of Honor, they are owned by their broadcaster, essentially, right? Sinclair is the network that owns a number of local Fox stations and things like that. So clearly they didn't see the benefit in trying to do empty events that would be an expense, and I guess they just thought that it would be more efficient and less of a money loss to just not do events, and to just probably, I imagine they're still paying people. We would probably be hearing if they weren't. But did they do something to their popularity by not running? I don't know. I think when you're Ring of Honor at this point, I really don't know how much Sinclair wants to invest in Ring of Honor. That's been the persistent question with Ring of Honor. Like, does Sinclair want Ring of Honor to become something bigger than what it is or what it was? I think it's certainly diminished from where it was in, say, 2015 or something like that. And I think in a lot of ways, AEW, both in terms of the talent that they acquired, who used to be associated with Ring of Honor, AEW has acquired many of them. I think there was a space that Ring of Honor, if it had the strategy and the leadership, could have occupied that now AEW instead has occupied. But I think, I think when you're at the scale that Ring of Honor is, where they're not among the top one or two companies in the U.S. scene, I think it doesn't take much to become bigger quickly. Not that it's easy, but if they, somehow got hold of a few stars that really created some buzz, I don't think it would take a super long time for them to recover and become more of a hot promotion again. Now, that said, I don't expect that to happen. I think the company has been hurt, at least somewhat, by whatever is going on with Marty Scurll. There's seems to be a lot of unanswered questions, and I think there are at least a section of fans who are highly aware of that. Ring of Honor's response, as far as I know, is that they're doing an internal investigation on the matter. Who knows what that means? Sounds kind of like a Velveteen Dream type story. I don't know. But yeah, I think things for Ring of Honor looked like they were starting to maybe get better and start to turn around at the beginning of this year before the pandemic, where it looked like they had a new management helping with creative, including Marty Scurll. But that's out now because he's now not a part of creative pending this investigation. So yeah, I think they're going to have some challenges, and it's going to be tough to become another company that's doing empty arena wrestling. Yeah, it's tough to be a Ring of Honor or an Impact Wrestling right now, I think. But I think even Impact Wrestling, in terms of, I don't know, just the buzz that I sort of feel about the companies that are, kind of on a national platform right now, it feels like Impact over this time, despite also being in front of no fans, has surpassed Ring of Honor, I would say, for sort of the brand value or the buzz that's around the company.
Let's talk about another company that's been having trouble recently, which is the NWA. I mean, they were really on the upswing with their product. They had a very entertaining product when the pandemic hit. Then they started to put out some new content all on YouTube, and then Dave Lagana's sex scandal came out. Billy Corgan still in charge over there. He's building a new leadership team, but it sounds like they're going with the old pay-per-view model that TNA used, weekly pay-per-view model that TNA used back in the day, from my understanding. Is that something that you think could be sustainable in 2020?
Is that what they're going to do? I haven't heard that. They're going to do weekly pay-per-views?
So that was my understanding. The last I heard was that they were going to start weekly pay-per-views.
Would it be through Fight or something?
Yeah, through Fight.
Yeah. Who's going to be in charge? I mean, you're asking me the question, but I don't know. Who's going to be in charge of, and who's going to take over Dave Lagana's duties, right? I don't know if you know, but
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's the question. I don't know. Dave Lagana did so much, right? Billy funded it and I'm sure participated to some extent, but everything, it sounds like, from the booking to the video production, that was Dave Lagana. And I don't know who would be ready to jump in and fill that spot, certainly in short order. You need somebody who's going to be ready to do all the things that he did, and to communicate with talent and be trusted by talent to whatever degree he was. So it's going to be a very uncertain time. I didn't even know that they're going to do pay-per-view. So that's interesting. You're getting me to talk about all the non-WWE and non-AEW topics that I don't talk enough about. So that's good.
Let's move back to the WWE topic.
Oh, sorry.
One thing that's come up, and in the past you've talked about it, others have talked about it, is pay-per-views. And right now the WWE, all their pay-per-views are on the network, $9.99 a month. It's going straight into their pocket. There has been talk about them selling those rights off to another streaming service, selling those rights off to a network. Is there, first off, there's obviously a lot of economic opportunity in selling rights off. There's no question about that. But is there an additional long-term benefit to, say, selling the rights off to Netflix or Amazon to try to be able to use those services to increase the population of casual fans who may take in the product in other ways?
I don't think I guess we're thinking about, like, well, if it's on Netflix, which I think Netflix is a less likely suitor than ESPN Plus or Peacock or even Amazon is. But I guess the idea is, so let's take maybe Amazon. Amazon Prime is in a lot of homes, maybe the majority of homes at this point, or at least I've heard something like 80% of you. Through that, you'd be in a lot of homes. The accessibility would be really high. And maybe there's more ways to sell the product to the customer that way. Maybe that doesn't hurt. And so you don't have to go through the hurdle of, being a WWE Network user, having the user account and, paying that way. You can just sort of maybe with your remote click it sort of the way that you would with pay-per-view. Maybe that doesn't hurt. I think the big advantage for WWE is that it would just mean guaranteed revenue, just like is the case for their television, right? For their television, they get fixed fees that they know what to expect. They escalate over time. They have a 5-year contract, and each payment is a little bit more than the last one per episode. And it would probably be similar for the pay-per-views in that, each year the money would get a little bit bigger. And that takes the risk out of it, especially for pay-per-views, right? And that was sort of the argument behind doing the network, is that rather than having business fluctuate based on whether you did a good pay-per-view or a bad pay-per-view buy rate that month, you sort of de-risk it and you just have people sort of sign on and set it and forget it, be a subscriber year round. And that's even why they tried to, when the network originally launched, they tried to get people tied into a 6-month commitment, which they eventually did away with because I think they felt like it was scaring people off. But I think the gamble of the network was that it would do ultimately maybe 3 to 4 million subscribers. And that was a number that was thrown around by now fired former co-president George Barrios, is that maybe they would do 3 to 4 million paid subscribers worldwide. And I think that AWE that had a stronger star creating ability and had stronger storytelling ability, I think something certainly a lot closer to 3 to 4 million was possible. So, but it's not. And Vince McMahon is going to be in control of creative for the foreseeable future, for as long as he's healthy, probably. And so I guess if you just accept that, that's the situation you got in your hands that you got to deal with, I guess, then the most secure thing, the most stable thing for investors to do is to just sell the pay-per-views off for guaranteed money. You get a lot of guaranteed money that way. You de-risk the pay-per-views. There's a little bit of risk involved with the network because you never know direct to consumer whether subs are going to go up or go down depending on the product that you sell. But then you also, like, you look at the network like this, is that, all right, we had to do that. And we take a lot of value, obviously, away from the network by taking the most valuable content that we've got on it, taking it off, selling it off to a streaming partner. But we still in all these 6 years of the network lifetime, at least you can say, well, that wasn't all completely wasted time. We still have this network service, and we can still, much like UFC Fight Pass, we still have this enormous library. And in fact, we have other things like probably the takeovers stay on there for whatever 205 Live and NXT UK are worth. Those are still on there, and those can still be sold to people. And I think there's still a large market, not a market of the 1.6 million subscribers that they have today, but there's a market of a few 100,000 subscribers, I think, that will stick around on average throughout the year, just to have access to the library and to have access to the takeovers live. On the other hand, who knows? The takeovers could be sold as well. But even the library, I think, alone is worth quite a bit to a couple 100,000 people. And I think the 205 Live and the NXT UKs and things like that, those certainly stay where they are. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It's good.
Yeah.
I can tell you that as if they just keep the takeovers and NXT UK on the network, that is worth my money right there. That is all I need for them to keep my $9.99. I got one more question before I get you out of here, and it's got to do, it kind of ties everything together. We talked about the pandemic. We've talked about future rights fees and the Thunderdome is a new emerging technology. Knowing that the pandemic's going to have a long tail, the economic recovery is going to have a long tail, knowing that there's going to be additional emerging technologies in the future, what do you think the economic outlook is for the wrestling business over the next 5 years?
I think, and this is something I've just started to talk about a little bit more, is I think we're heading towards like a mid 2022 where like what probably happens is there's a big showdown in TV rights negotiations between, WWE courting networks and AEW courting networks, possibly at the same time. So I think how that plays out is AEW just got a renewal right at the beginning of this year with Warner Media through the end of 2023. There's an option in that contract to extend it through 2024. Warner Media seems pretty happy with them right now. So I think it's most likely at this point that they pick up that option through 2024, right? So that I think negotiations usually start to happen about a year and a half prior to the expiration of the contract, right? So that would put AEW, if the option is picked up, that would put AEW's negotiations around the middle of 2022, right? And then that would also WWE, regardless, there's no option associated with their contracts. Their contracts are going to expire at the end of Q3 2024. However it works, I've already thought about this. They would end up being maybe a quarter apart, but almost around the same time. So maybe they're both being shopped around the middle of 2022, both Raw and SmackDown. Who knows what happens with NXT? I think NXT may be up for renewal probably 2 years from when it debuted. So who knows what the future of NXT will be. But we know Raw and SmackDown when they expire. So Raw and SmackDown are being renegotiated, and maybe by 2022, we're further along. We're about 2 more years down the line on the trajectory of the viewership competition that we're seeing here. And we know, AEW is beating NXT, at least in the key demo every week. Some weeks lately now they're beating them in P2 Plus in the total audience. And in fact, we're seeing in recent years, I think we're seeing sort of what I predicted back in September is that I figured, maybe in a couple of years from September 2019, we would be in a place where Wednesday night would be the leading wrestling night when you combined NXT and AEW. For the key demo, in the last several weeks, we're already there. We're at a place right now where it's a tight competition for key demo viewership. When I say key demo, I mean adults 18 to 49. So that when you combine AEW and NXT, which of course run head to head, that audience is almost equal in size and often beating the size of Raw's audience. And SmackDown does a similar performance as Raw. So we're even starting to see now, NXT and AEW combined beat Raw. We have more information about Raw, so I'm mainly going to talk about Raw, but starting to beat Raw in various demographics, right? The key demo, especially younger demographics, WWE, they are the king of the P50 plus. Old people are loyal to WWE, and which makes sense, right? It's just this is the brand of wrestling that's been around longest, and it's been the major league for decades. But we're going to be 2 years into this, in the middle of 2020, and even AEW we've seen in the last couple of weeks in like single demographics in a single week. We'll see AEW Dynamite actually beat Raw a couple of weeks ago for the female 12 to 34 demographic. And in another week, it beat Raw for the male 12 to 34 demographic. So what I expect to see, barring like somebody else taking over creative, which I can't see as long as Vince McMahon is healthy, what I think we're going to see is the continued trajectory of AEW getting closer and closer to what Raw does and what SmackDown does. And maybe by 2022, the viewership of Dynamite and AEW will have a third program by then, because probably whenever the pandemic is clear enough, I think we're definitely going to see another hour of AEW program on some Warner Media TV station, whether that's TNT or TBS or whatever. But I think we're going to see by 2022, Dynamite's competing in a lot of weeks with Raw and SmackDown's viewership at that point. And then I think if you're the networks who are, negotiating with WWE, and you're in other networks negotiating with AEW, or maybe some networks even negotiating with both, I think you've got to question, why are the values of these properties so different? Right now, they are quite different. Raw and SmackDown are essentially 12 times the value of Dynamite on a per hour basis, right? So that's accounted for the different amounts of hours that they supply on a weekly basis. If you break it down per hour, Raw and SmackDown are worth 12 times that of AEW. So I think that discrepancy does not survive in that scenario. We end up with, I think most likely we end up with, maybe a modest increase, a decent increase for Raw, maybe less than double. Who knows? It's whenever people talk about this, they always point out how difficult it is to predict what the media environment is going to be, even 2 years from now. But I think the most likely scenario, if the viewership is where I just said it might be, where Dynamite and Raw and SmackDown are quite comparable, then I think we end up with a small increase for Raw and a great increase for Dynamite, so that, ultimately those programs on a per hour basis become probably AEW is worth a little bit less still, because it doesn't have the legacy and the track record of WWE, unless by that time Dynamite is just well exceeding Raw and SmackDown. But who knows? But I think we end up in a wrestling industry where now AEW has even more money, and WWE becomes even more threatened by AEW, because the TV revenue money becomes more comparable, because WWE has 5 hours just between Raw and SmackDown, perhaps 7 if NXT gets an upgrade on the USA Network. Maybe they do. So they've got 7 hours versus 3. And who knows, maybe it'll be up for grabs whether AEW would add an additional hour to Warner Media, or to some other business partner, to some other TV partner. But to get back on track, AEW and WWE would have similar TV money. Now WWE would still be, in that scenario, would still be a much larger company than AEW, even if their US TV money on a per hour basis got closer. WWE would still probably greatly outweigh AEW for overall TV money in the US market, would greatly outweigh AEW for TV revenue on a worldwide basis. WWE still has a big deal in India. It's number 2 market. And I think they have pretty closely comparable TV deals in the UK as it is right now, though. But nonetheless, WWE has a long history, and they have partnerships with many brands, and they have a stronger consumer products presence with companies like Mattel for their toys, and for the action figures, and companies like Take-Two Sports or 2K Sports for the video games. But I think all that, too long didn't read to say that I think we're going to end up, I think it's, if I were to bet today in August 2020, that I think we're going to end up in a wrestling future in 5 years or so that's going to be even more competitive between WWE and AEW than it is now, because they will be WWE will be more threatened, and AEW will be more funded.
And that's all great news for the fan too.
Hopefully. It usually is. Greater competition at a high level is usually good for fans. It will probably continue to be very good for talent, because the competition for talent will become even more fierce than it has become in the last couple of years. So talent will probably be paid more. And hopefully it will result in a better product for consumers.
He is the world's leading authority on wrestling business. Brandon Thurston is over at Wrestlenomics.com. The Wrestlenomics podcast is available wherever you get your podcast. Brandon, thanks a lot for taking time to talk to me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Appreciate it. Thanks to Brandon Thurston from Wrestlenomics for joining us on this week's episode of the Duckpin Podcast. Please be sure to check out his site, Wrestlenomics.com. Subscribe to his Wrestlenomics radio podcast. If you are a fan of either pro wrestling or very interested in business, you should check out Wrestlenomics. And if you like this show, please subscribe to the Duckpin Podcast on the podcatcher of your choice. We're on all the big podcast apps. If you're watching us on YouTube, please click that subscribe button and make sure that you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes of the Duckpin Podcast. Please recommend us to a neighbor, a colleague, somebody that likes podcasts and likes interesting discussion with people who are making stuff happen. That's how podcasts like this one grow. So we appreciate your help doing that. And of course, the duckpin.com, we have all sorts of great writers doing work over there, so I encourage you to check that out. And please follow us. We are at the Duckpin on all the social media sites. And hey, be sure to check out our Teespring store as well. Buy yourself a Duckpin logo t-shirt. Thanks for joining me in this week's episode of the Duckpin Podcast. I am Brian Griffiths. Thank you and good night.